everyone. Great. Trigger warning, I will be talking about butchering and harvesting chickens as well as chickens for eggs. So just want you to know, like, let's sit with that a little bit, and it's never done lightly. It's always really important. And actually that's what I wanted to start with, is how I got into chicken farming was actually through a sort of animal encounter and a harvesting experience as a 7th and 8th grader going to Slide Ranch. We did a field trip, and we had the option of participating in a harvest of a spent hen, like a hen that had just lived her life and she wasn't really laying anymore, and we actually watched her run around in the yard, and she was getting pecked by the other hen. She was definitely like getting older and not looking so hot, and it was time. And we sat as a group. It was actually incredible as like 7th graders to sit around, and we read this essay by the man who founded Slide Ranch about harvesting animals and plants, and how being a human is to be a killer, and that we actually have to kill other creatures, whether it's a cabbage or a chicken. We do eat animals and plants, and so do, that's part of the web of life, and so do all these other creatures. So he was taking it as stepping into his, like, being a human. And a lot of us at the time were kind of dabbling in vegetarianism, and most of the kids wanted nothing to do with the chicken harvest. There was a couple tough boys that wanted to like be the one to dispatch the chicken, and I was the only girl involved, and I was the only one who would touch the chicken after it died. So I got this incredible experience because I was so fascinated with this body that this chicken had made, and I had this private lesson with my Waldorf teacher, like standing next to me. We just dissected a chicken together, and I got to see all the little yolks lined up to become eggs, and all these parts that are just, it's really incredible what's in there. And I had the experience of then eating the chicken, so then we sent the meat that I had pulled off to the kitchen crew, because some kids, a bunch of kids were happy to cook the chicken afterwards. And we all ate the chicken, and it was the most delicious and most like real food experience I had had up to that point. And I felt that cycle, that like seeing the chicken alive and then seeing it dead and being part of the processing and making it into food. And at that point, I didn't want to have any more meat if I couldn't do that. And I became a vegetarian that day, and never, not never, but for years, and then became vegan, and was very into like animal rights and, caring for the animals, and I didn't want to see that, commercial industrial farming. But finally my body just spoke to me, and I had to eat. I was grumpy all the time and low energy, and I finally did start eating meat again, and it was only later I was able to kind of come back around to being a farmer and actually participating again. But that was always what was calling to me. And so I started keeping chickens about 8 years ago. Started a co-op with friends to do meat and eggs. And I learned a lot of hard lessons about that. At the time I was obsessed with heritage birds, because I really loved this idea of like a really natural chicken that can sustain itself and forage, and it's going to be good for meat and eggs, and it could, you can breed your own, and there's really beautiful things about heritage birds, because they have a lot of these great old genetics, and they can be self-sufficient. They can, breed their own babies and stuff. But what I wasn't aware of was, there is a whole feed to output ratio, and if you have a meat bird, they actually eat more food because they're a bigger body, and if you're trying to get eggs out of them, you're feeding them a lot more for like a lot less eggs. And if you're trying to satisfy a co-op of like 5 families, you're not getting that output, you're not getting the production. And so there's this whole chicken math that you have to do when you're thinking of how many eggs your family is gonna eat, and then there's all kinds of chicken math, and then thinking about how that's gonna work. And so since then I've learned a lot about selecting breeds. I still love heritage birds, but I also get hybridized egg-laying like producers. And I learned a lot through the co-op around, how to share labor, and like the labor of chickens can be very simplified. At the time, I was obsessed with Whole Foods and Weston Price, and so I was feeding my chicks only whole grains, and I wasn't doing any soy or corn. I never did soy or corn. We were, it's not easy, but we did it. So I was getting whole peas and like Milo grain and wheat and a couple others, and we would soak whole grains and then like soak them overnight, strain them, and then I was blending them in a Vitamix for my chicks with beef liver and other organs and seaweed powder, and like these chicks were getting amazing nutrients. But it turns out chicks and chickens are so domesticated now that most of them cannot assimilate their nutrients from raw foods. They can't get all of the things they need, especially B vitamins. And what I found is that I was doing an unknown, I didn't realize I was doing an experiment, and I found out that a lot of the chicks, their legs did not develop properly, and I ended up finally supplementing. I bought this thing called Fertrell's Vita Blend or whatever, and it's like a powdered vitamin mix, and I had to mix that in, and then they were able to develop. But I lost chicks at that time, and I caution everyone against this, that like it was really great intentions, but because of, chickens are so, they've been bred, and they produce so much, so they've gone down these roads of being highly domesticated. But what I learned is that Barred Plymouth Rocks, actually the rooster that makes this feather, they did the best. So they were one of those good old hardy, those black and white striped speckled hens and roosters. They survived the best out of in my experiment. And if I did it again, I would start with like 5 times as many chicks and really do, and really select for that, because I think it is a worthwhile experiment. But now I stopped soaking grains and doing it all at once. I had a child. We didn't have to grind them up once they were of age, but that was definitely because they were my babies at the time when I had that time. But I think supplementing with whole grains and everything is great. And if you want to learn, there's a whole bunch about fermenting grains and getting more nutrients out of them by soaking them. And at this point, the only treats I offer my chickens are black sunflower seeds. I just get like organic whole black oil sunflower seeds because they're 17% protein. Any of the other things are going to be like 7% protein or 6%. Everyone likes to throw oats out. That's like 5% protein or something. And you're really just giving them a bunch of sugar and carbs, as we know. That's not going to like build nutrition and make their eggs healthy and their meat as nutritious as it could be. So that's important. If you want them to warm up, you can throw them some oats or something that's like, carbs heat you up on like a cold night. You're worried about your chickens. But honestly, you don't need to worry about chickens getting warm because they are little heaters. In fact, if you can find a way to like build your chicken coop next to your bedroom and like use that thermal heat, you'll be set because they're amazing. They have like an outfit. So there's so much. Okay, I'm going to talk about getting chicks as though you've never had chickens before. I'm sure there's tons of knowledge in this room and people have done all kinds of things. But to get chicks, you can start with a fertilized egg and incubate. You can get a chick, like a 1-day-old chick is the classic thing. You can get pullets, which would be a bird that is old enough to be determined as a female, but it may not be laying yet. So that's a pullet. And then a hen would be like a chicken that is laying. Of course, they might also be roosters. And there's different places to get all of these things. You can buy eggs and chicks and pullets through the mail. There's a lot of hatcheries, and they will ship them through the U.S. Postal Service to you. You can buy chicks at a feed store, and they don't usually sell eggs or pullets, but a feed store, just something to be aware of, is getting, they're getting the chicks at some point, and they're going to be feeding them probably a non-organic, like whatever is in the cheapest in their store, for however many days. So that's just something to consider. Some people want like a very pure chick. And then there's a vaccination issue. So there's no mRNA vaccinations for chickens at this point, but there's coccidiosis and Marek's vaccines. And those are offered at an extra charge if you order from a hatchery. So if you order directly from a hatchery, you get an unvaccinated chick unless you request a vaccination. And what I've learned is not surprising that vaccinating against these diseases does not actually prevent them in your flock, that coccidiosis and Marek's often dwell within healthy birds, but just like other viruses and things, they come forward if a hen is unwell, and that you otherwise, if you're too confined or they're not getting a clean enough, environment or something. But a lot of those diseases, they went down along with hygiene and other things. It's like very similar to human vaccines. So I opt out of the vaccinations. I've never had any issues with those things. And I'll tell you some good tips on how to keep them healthy. So, I also want to mention another really great place to get your stock is from your neighbors or a local breeder. There's Alchemist Farm in Sebastopol that is excellent and does really specialized like colored egg layers. So you can get like, you know, your rose colored egg layer and your like olive green egg layer. You're gonna pay a lot of money for each chick, and it's gonna be so important to try to keep those chicks alive because you're like $8 a chick in already. So it's something to consider. And I always recommend getting 3 times as many chicks as you expect to have. And then you also have to account for male versus female. So if you're buying straight run, which is cheaper, that means you're getting chicks that could be male or female. And you're gonna just expect it'll be 60% roosters or more. So don't ever guess that you're gonna end up with lots of hens, because you probably won't, and you could end up with all roosters. You can order chicks that are sexed for female or male, but that's not guaranteed. You definitely end up with like plenty of what you didn't want. So again, you kind of always want extra because you might end up with more than you need of the wrong kind. Neighbors, if they have a rooster, and you'll know your neighbor has a rooster because you can hear them, all their eggs in their coop should be fertile if they have a healthy rooster and healthy hens. And honestly, a great barnyard mix is, you know, that hybrid vigor is excellent. Like, it's really helpful to get chickens that aren't interbred just for like this one, you know, feathering or something. If you get some that are like, oh, these were my favorite chickens that survived through all these things, and now like these are their eggs. Those are going to be fun ones to incubate, and then their feathering will be all interesting, and it's very exciting. But yeah, there's something to think about too of your long-term like sustainability and where you're going to get your breeding stock next year, because if you want to have eggs as close to year-round as possible, you have to have fresh chicks every year. And it's a big responsibility. And that's why I really advocate for going for a co-op situation, so that maybe like 3 or 4 neighbors are working together and they take turns brooding the chicks each year. Because it's a project for a few months where you're needing to check on little tiny beings and make sure that they're not too hot and not too cold, and they have food and water, and they don't get too wet, or they can't get wet at all. And if any power goes out, then you have to make sure they're still warm, and it's a lot to keep chicks. And but to buy a pullet, like a full-grown pullet, is like a minimum of $30 you know, a young bird. So it's a lot to consider. And I think raising chicks is amazing, and there's a lot of things you can do to make it simpler. I use a lot of hanging feeders, and I get these waters from Premier One, which I recommend, that are buckets with little indentations, and then there's a nipple. So it's like a bucket you can set on the ground, it won't leach anything, but when you lift it up, there's these little nipples, and they peck at the little nipples, and then that drops the water, and that keeps the water clean. And you can teach them from day one. You can just put that in the brooder, and they'll know. And they're yellow, they're attracted to yellow and red things, so they'll peck at it anyway. But that's the first thing you do when you get your chicks home anyway, is show them the water and then set them down. They don't have to eat right away. But you'll want to make sure that water's clean, and if you want to do apple cider vinegar in your water, make sure you don't put apple cider vinegar in all the water, which I also learned that can be a dehydrating thing for them. And so in the heat, you want to make sure they have plain water as an option, as well as apple cider vinegar. But a little apple cider, like a tablespoon or 2 is nice. It's good for their gut and all the probiotic stuff, as well as keeping them alkalized. Supposed to be helpful for parasites. Okay, so with these chickens and all these chicks and these summer roosters, you really need to have a plan for the cycle of life. I know so many chicken farmers that are so excited for the living chicken, but there's a lot of times that chickens get sick or they die. Chickens are really good at dying in like all kinds of ways, all ages, and you need to be ready for that. And taking an animal, you know, any pet, we know it's a big responsibility, but even chickens, we can get attached to them, and we need to be aware of this cycle that's going to happen at some point. I do know a chicken that's like 13 years old, but that's pretty rare. And that's not my chicken. I cull them sooner than that. And that is something I do. So I cull at like 4 years, usually 4 or 5 years. I don't keep chickens older than that, because they stop laying almost completely at that point. You can get you know, depending what bird they are. If they're heritage hen, they might lay a little bit throughout, but they're not gonna be a producer at that point. And so then I really value them as food, as meat. But I've processed chickens in lots of different ways. I processed it with like hardly any equipment. It's really handy if you have like a plucker and like all these handy things, but you can definitely just do it at home. And like probably all of our great grandparents were doing it in their backyards. So don't be intimidated, and you can call me if you need help. I'll at least advise you. Oh, and with that, I really recommend if there's any one book, this is the only book I ever look at, honestly. It's by Harvey Ussery, Ussery, and he's talking about an all-natural approach to raising and breeding chickens and other fowl for home and market growers. He has really excellent tips on all of this stuff, including he even gives you like a play-by-play of how to process your bird and like how to take it apart and everything if you need to harvest. But he's also talking about his great-grandma's farm that he grew up on. Was the hens were all free-range. They didn't eat any processed food at all. And that's what he says is sort of the spectrum we can strive towards, is like these really amazing, robust environments for our chickens to just harvest what they need, you know, if we have some epic garden or farm. Most of us don't have that, so we're going to be closer to the spectrum of having some industrial feed, and then we're going to try to supplement and try to give them some free range and all the things they need, which are important. There's the food that they really go for when they're out on their own. They're going to go for green plants, seeds and fruits, and animal foods. And that's something to think about if they're enclosed and confined. You want to think about ways to introduce those things to them. So that might mean that you like cut or pull some grass for them and are throwing that in there. Because that'll, hopefully if you pull it up with the roots, it might even have some bugs and worms at the bottom. You're going to want to make sure you're creating the environment. So there's this really helpful thing called deep litter management. If you're in a stationary coop, or even a coop that's moving that has an enclosed bottom, if you can create a foot deep of litter, which is just bedding of any kind, I recommend like as much wild bedding, like raked up leaves and things like that, but you can use wood shavings like from the store is the simplest thing. And you create basically a compost yard underneath your chickens. And so by having a really thick layer of bedding, they're always going to have things to eat in there, and that's where you're throwing your scraps and stuff, and bugs will start living in there if you have dirt access, if it's touching the dirt. And that is this incredible thing that then you don't have to clean all the time, actually. All you do is throw fresh, dry stuff on top. If it starts to smell, like trust your instincts. If you're smelling ammonia, that means there's too much moisture. You might need to fluff it up a little and then throw some more dry stuff on top. It's really sweet, and you only have to clean out your coop like once a year or every 2 years sometimes, because it's constantly composting and getting broken down, and you're just putting dry stuff on top. And they've shown that even birds that are getting it fed a deficient diet will make it up if they're in a nice mature composted yard, because they can find what they need. So that's a really great tip, and that's Harvey Ussery talks about that too. But definitely trust your nose with all your management, even if you're not doing deep litter, especially. If you go in your coop, it shouldn't be an unpleasant experience. If you're smelling a lot of poop, it's a management issue. It needs to be cleared out, and usually, there needs to be some other thing happening. Nest boxes are really important to clear out at least every 3 weeks, because parasites are on a 3-week cycle. So if you let your nest box sit for 4 weeks, that has chances for these parasites like mites and fleas to become populated in your litter inside the nest boxes. I just use like shavings. Straw is not very absorbent; it can kind of make more messes. So like dry wood shavings, but you'll want to put sprinkle some in there. Put a little diatomaceous earth, which is a helpful preventative, and then put little shavings on top, because the chickens don't want to breathe that directly either. Make sure you're wearing a dust mask. It's the one time to wear a mask, everyone, is when you're cleaning your nest boxes. And then just make sure, you clear that out, and probably even check that outside of the coop, like put that in the compost pile or something, because that's, if it has any eggs in it or anything, you want to get those out of the coop. And if you get behind on it, you just have to get back on it, basically, like make sure you go on those cycles. Diatomaceous earth is really helpful. It can be sprinkled like around the edges of your coop. and you kind of, like, anytime you're layering bedding, putting a little of that down and then a little more over, and that'll help with some prevention. The main thing for chickens is that they bathe in dust. So the main thing for preventing parasites for them is to make sure they have access to a dust bath, which usually they'll just make on the ground. They'll just dig out a hole and they'll be flapping around in there. You can supercharge that dust bath. You can put a little dietary matrix, just earth wherever they're making a hole. There's like any aromatic herbs are really helpful. A powdered fennel I found is like the cheapest one you get from whatever. Powdered fennel, throwing that in there. So just to add, and then making sure if they don't have a great place to dig out, then you actually need to make them a dust box. So the plans for it, it's like a big giant box because they actually kick the dust so much. You can't just have like a tiny little basin. But I've used that for when it's really wet out and all the ground is wet. They don't have any way to get clean. Like they don't clean themselves with water. So you have to give them somewhere dry. And there's recipes for that. But it has to be sort of a sandy, dusty mixture. It's like a very particular thing. So that is like one of these management issues with chickens. But that makes a really big difference for them. So we talked a little bit about food, and then there's water, and then grit and oyster shell are the other main inputs. So as babies, you can start them on grit right away. They can get chick grit, which is like very, very tiny little rocks. Basically, they have to have these rocks to grind up their food, and you'll find it if you ever process them in their gizzard, which is this crazy little muscular organ, and there'll be like pieces of gravel in there with a bunch of straw and everything else. So that's what they're using to break down their food. So you have to make sure if they were on like a gravel lot or something, maybe they wouldn't need grit, but most of the time they need it. And you can just get it from the feed store. It's not expensive. I'm sure there's a way to harvest it yourself. I haven't figured that out. And then oyster shell they'll need as they start laying. So that's really important to make sure they have free choice to grit and oyster shell. I just put it in dog dishes, but there are like fancy feeders and things you can get. I just like to make sure I can see, and you want to make sure that's always dry and clean. For some reason they need it dry to get wet inside them. I don't know why. But the oyster shell, you'll get the flaked oyster shell, not the powdered oyster shell. Does that make sense? You get the powdered oyster shell for like agricultural garden use, so make sure you request the flaked stuff. And that's also really important for their eggshells. They're just like humans in the sense that they're pulling from their own bodies to make a baby or their eggs. So they have to be constantly replenishing their own calcium and for their own bones. And then that will be what, you'll see the eggshells. If the eggshells are becoming thin, that's like not good because that means they're already depleted in their body, right? So you want to make sure you're really supplementing them. And the food will shift. So there's, the commercial feed that we all buy there's like a mixture for young birds, and then there's a different formulation for older birds. So you just want to make sure you're not feeding them the older bird food too young because it will be high in calcium, but that can be damaging to their organs at a young age. So if you have to feed them a couple days of that stuff, that's okay, but it's a big deal because if you're managing a flock that's always has chicks coming in, you have to put everybody on chick food for that time that the chicks are still young. So then you must have oyster shell so that those hens can still get what they need while everybody's eating baby food. Does that make sense? And then for food, I really recommend, if you can afford it, I recommend the company called Scratch and Peck. They're out of Washington, and they do locally sourced, all organic, good stuff. I use Modesto milling, which is also a really good resource. And then Bar Ale is where I'm buying my mixed feed now. So Bar Ale is out of Williams, and they have a soy and corn-free mix. But if you're interested in that, come talk to me because you have to request it a certain way. The only place I've gotten it is Rivertown, and they actually don't know that it's soy and corn-free organic. If you ask for that, they'll be like, "What? What are you talking about?" You have to call it a soy-free organic. I think is all they have on there. But anyway. There are other places to get feed in Marin, but I haven't followed up on those. I don't know if we'll talk about later if anyone has any tips on that. Okay, I'm almost done with my talk. I'm going to hear your questions. Okay, I was going to mention really quick about meat birds. So one thing you can do is just, if you want meat birds, you can just get straight run chicks and end up with however many meat birds and just harvest those extra roosters. or you can hatch out your own chicks and end up with extra roosters, or you can like purposely go and order chicks for meat purposes. And something to be aware of is that all of the chicken that we buy in the store is typically a Cornish cross or something like that, which is a meat bird, which you can buy the chicks for. And they are meat machines, and they do nothing but eat all day. They don't run around very much. They don't necessarily grow all their feathers, but by 6 to 8 weeks, they're ready to harvest. So those birds are, I know people that have grown them in their backyard, and it's like not that pretty because they aren't like fun running around birds. They're actually kind of gross. But they produce meat at an alarming rate, and like 8 weeks is incredible if you think about it. So they're able to harvest that and have their meat for the freezer. That's cool. I haven't done that. You can get freedom rangers or other range birds that are designed, they take a little longer to grow. Maybe they harvest at like 4 to 6 months, and they're going to be better foragers. They get all their feathers. They're not like just machines. And that's still a great project. I think, the more self-sufficiency we have, the better. And it's not that, like, working with small animals is a great start, I think, for a lot of us, because it's a little easier to take on a cow or something. And I wanted to mention brooding ourselves versus brooding with a mama hen. So something I got to experience a few times now is working with mother hens, which taught me everything I ever needed to know about how to raise chicks. And that's that it's this constant, amazing process that really a mama hen should do, and we shouldn't try to imitate. But we approximate it with like our heat lamps and all of our stuff. But this mama hen can go out the very first day with her babies, like right after they hatch, and they'll forage right away. And she'll just cuddle them to her when it's a little cold out, or she'll shoo them away if it's warm. And it's this incredible natural thing. It's a little tricky to manage a broody hen while she's setting on the eggs. But if you can handle her for those 21 days, then there's like the months after that she's going to do all the work. Wow. Whereas if you're getting chicks, you just get those right away. But then you have months of caring for them, and they're going to grow, and you have to have like a small house, really small house at first, and then people think of the chicken coop, but you actually need the in-between house too, because there's like a time when they're big enough to kind of run around, but they might still need the heat lamp a little bit, but they're not quite ready to be all the way outside. So there's a lot to like think of those age ranges. If you can breed them, if you can have them with a mama hen, they can go right in the coop right away, and she'll just be with them. But there's this time where the hens don't necessarily go back to the same nest, so you can't just let a broody sit in your hen house, because she will get confused and she'll go sit on some other eggs after she takes her break. So you have to actually have them. I had them in separate little dog carriers, so I had like 3 going at a time, and I had like done a whole thing where I separated my chickens so I could have breeding groups. A whole other topic, because they stay fertile from a mating for like 3 weeks, so you have to separate them for like a month to have like just that rooster's genetics. So I have these breeding groups, and then I put these eggs under these hens, and then you have to let them out once a day, and they come out only once a day to take a dust bath, eat some food and water, and then they hop back right back to their nest, and then they go into this like really zen state. And I don't know if you've ever seen a broody hen, but it's kind of amazing. They're just there, and they become really puffy, and they're just making all this heat, and it's a lot, and you don't really want to mess with them. They have this incredible growl if you get too close. They pull all the feathers off the front here to like create this little patch of moisture so they can keep all the eggs at the right humidity. Wow. And that also helps feather the nest. Wow. Yeah, it's incredible. And incubators, again, like we're trying to approximate it, but it's nothing like that. Wow. They're really cool. So then they hatch, and it takes 21 days to hatch, and then little chicks will arrive. And then if you have a good hen, you can usually just integrate her back with everyone else. And then you can also take chicks and stick them under a hen that's broody. Like if you have a hen that's trying to hatch eggs in your coop but you don't really want her to hatch, you can actually try putting chicks under her. I did that, and I had some success. I had like both. So the trouble is the chicks arrive in the mail a couple days old, like they've already been in the mail for 2 days. If they're hatching right under the hen, they're like sleepy, it's just like a newborn, like they take a little while, and the mama's kind of sleepy and she's kind of coming out of her zen. and they wake up together. But if you just throw these like 2-day-old, like chirping little hyper chicks under a hen, I had one hen that did not. I was not okay with it at all. She started flinging the chicks away from her, and she's like, "You were obviously not my babies. You're like hyper," and it's not. She did not accept the chicks, so those ones I did have to brood with a light. But then this other batch I put under this other hen, she took right to them, and then her 2 friends that were brooding next to her decided that they were going to help too, and they became this little chicken co-op, and they were like all helping and raise the chicks together, and one of them would be like keeping them warm in the nest, the other one would be like showing them around, and they were, it was amazing, like so you never know what they're going to do, and you have to kind of be ready for anything, and be prepared in case it doesn't work out the way you planned, because plans don't always work out. But yeah, I think that's the main thing.
Yeah, that was really great.